On the morning of December 7, 1941, at 7:42 a.m., Commander Minoru Genda observed the return of Japanese aircraft to the carrier Akagi, positioned 230 miles north of Oahu. The task force had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, maintaining complete radio silence throughout its 12-day voyage across the North Pacific. The strike force represented the largest carrier formation ever assembled. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, supported by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers. The attack had achieved remarkable tactical success with devastating results for the American Pacific Fleet. The immediate results. The destruction at Pearl Harbor was extensive. 4 American battleships were sunk outright. The Arizona exploded with such force that debris fell across Ford Island, a quarter-mile away. The Oklahoma capsized completely, rolling 150 degrees to port and trapping over 400 men inside. The West Virginia and California settled to the harbor bottom, their superstructures visible above water, but their hulls shattered by torpedo strikes. 4 additional battleships sustained severe damage. The Nevada, which attempted to get underway during the attack, was beached to prevent her from blocking the harbor channel. The Pennsylvania sat damaged in dry dock. The Maryland and Tennessee were trapped behind capsized vessels, their decks torn by bomb hits. In total, 18 ships were destroyed or crippled, and 2,403 Americans lost their lives, with hundreds more wounded. Japan's losses were remarkably light, only 29 aircraft out of 353 launched, 9 Zero fighters, 5 torpedo bombers, and 15 dive bombers, representing barely 8% of the attacking force. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the airstrike, reported to Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo that the mission had achieved complete success. The American Pacific Fleet appeared crippled, and the path seemed clear for Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia. The critical oversight. However, Commander Genda recognized a profound strategic failure, despite the tactical victory. The celebration around him contrasted sharply with the mathematical reality he understood. While everyone focused on the burning battleships, the attack had missed the most strategically vital targets. Most critically, 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil remained untouched in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor. These 49 massive cylindrical tanks, distributed across 3 facilities constructed between 1913 and 1923, represented the entire fuel supply for the United States Pacific Fleet. The lower tank farm, constructed between 1913 and 1923, held approximately 1.4 million barrels in 22 tanks. The original 5 tanks from 1913 held 35,000 to 50,000 barrels each, with 17 additional tanks added in 1923, each holding 50,000 barrels. The middle tank farm contained roughly 500,000 barrels in 10 tanks. The upper tank farm, the largest facility, held approximately 2.5 million barrels in 17 tanks with each 150,000 barrel capacity. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later observe that all 4.5 million barrels were vulnerable to 50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The tanks were designed for peacetime efficiency rather than wartime security, built above ground, visible from the air, and clustered together to minimize piping distances. The vulnerability that wasn't exploited. Japanese reconnaissance had thoroughly documented these facilities. Takeo Yoshikawa, operating under the alias Tadashi Morimura from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, had spent months observing Pearl Harbor, reporting weekly on fleet movements and base infrastructure through coded telegraph messages. The vulnerability of these tanks was extraordinary. Their thin steel walls were designed merely to contain liquid under atmospheric pressure. An armor-piercing bomb or even a smaller 500-pound bomb would rupture a tank completely. While fuel oil is less volatile than gasoline, it burns intensely and persistently. A ruptured tank would create fires lasting days or weeks, with heat sufficient to rupture adjacent tanks even without direct hits. The Pacific Fleet carried approximately 760,000 barrels of fuel in its oilers and ship bunkers, less than 1/6 of the total stored at Pearl Harbor. In the first 9 days following the attack, the fleet consumed approximately 750,000 barrels conducting search operations and securing approaches to Hawaii, nearly exhausting its entire seaborne fuel capacity. The strategic consequences of destruction. Had these storage facilities been destroyed, the consequences would have been severe for American naval operations. The Pacific Fleet would have been forced to withdraw to the West Coast, San Diego, San Francisco, or Seattle, more than 2,000 miles away. Operating from California, American ships would have required twice as much fuel to reach Western Pacific war zones. The operational range of every American warship would have been effectively cut in half. A destroyer capable of operating for 10 days in the Philippines when based at Pearl Harbor could operate only 4 days when based in San Diego, consuming most of its fuel traveling to and from the operational area. American ability to interfere with Japanese operations in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies would have been severely compromised for 12 to 18 months, possibly longer. Rebuilding 4.5 million barrels of storage capacity could not be accomplished quickly. Each tank required extensive engineering, construction, and testing. Support infrastructure, pumping stations, pipelines, loading facilities, and fire suppression systems would need complete reconstruction under wartime conditions while fighting a two-ocean war. The planning failure. The Japanese attack plan did not prioritize these fuel storage facilities. Pilots received no briefing on their importance, and no ordnance was allocated for their destruction. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes focused exclusively on battleships, dramatic targets that appeared strategically important but were becoming obsolete. Aircraft carriers, submarines, repair facilities, dry docks, and most critically, fuel storage, these truly vital targets were either absent that morning or deliberately ignored. This was not accidental, but resulted from fundamental miscalculations about modern naval warfare made during the planning phase, particularly regarding fuel consumption, oil production, tanker capacity, and how long Japan could sustain war without American oil imports. Japan's strategic miscalculations. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, serving as senior staff officer to Admiral Yamamoto, was known as one of the Navy's most intellectually brilliant officers. He could recite from memory the fuel capacity and cruising range of every major warship in both the Japanese and American fleets. In early 1941, Japanese naval planners faced a critical question. Could Japan sustain war against the United States? The answer depended entirely on oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum, consuming approximately 32 to 37 million barrels per year for all purposes, military and civilian combined. Most came from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The American oil embargo imposed on July 26, 1941, following Japanese occupation of southeast French Indochina, cut off Japan's primary supply source. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed with their own embargoes, cutting Japan off from more than 80% of its oil imports. By September 1941, Japan possessed approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves distributed between Navy stocks, army stocks, and civilian reserves. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone consumed approximately 2,900 barrels per hour during routine peacetime operations, or 69,600 barrels daily, or 25.4 million barrels annually. Combined with army and civilian consumption, Japan was rapidly depleting its 50 million barrel reserve. The three fatal assumptions. Japanese planning rested on three critical assumptions, each seemingly reasonable, but ultimately catastrophically wrong. First assumption: the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. Americans, accustomed to comfort and unwilling to accept heavy casualties, would agree to a compromise recognizing Japanese control of Southeast Asia after initial defeats. This meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign. Long-term sustainability seemed irrelevant. Second assumption: naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine. Based on the 1905 victory at Tsushima, strategists expected the combined fleet to remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to steam west. One or two major fleet engagements would destroy the American fleet in climactic surface actions. Most Japanese ships would spend most of their time at anchor, consuming minimal fuel with only small portions of the fleet actively operating. Fuel consumption would be predictable, manageable, and relatively low. Third assumption: capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would permanently solve Japan's supply problem. Oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels annually in 1940. Japanese planners estimated military consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing these fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs indefinitely. Based on these assumptions, Japanese planners concluded they could fight and win. With 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of capturing 65 million barrels per year of production capacity, the mathematics appeared sound and the strategy viable. The reality? Every assumption was wrong. The war was not short. The United States did not negotiate after 6 months. Americans responded to Pearl Harbor not with defeatism, but with furious determination. President Franklin Roosevelt's declaration that December 7th would live in infamy united the country. American industrial capacity shifted to total war production, shipyards building warships instead of merchant vessels, factories producing tanks and aircraft instead of automobiles. The conflict lasted 3 years and 8 months, not 6 months. Naval operations did not follow the decisive battle pattern. The Pacific War involved continuous operations across vast distances. Carrier task forces conducting raids thousands of miles from home. Submarines on extended patrols hunting convoys. Amphibious assaults on scattered islands requiring massive escort forces. And destroyers constantly shuttling between bases escorting supply convoys. Every operation required constant movement and fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. A single destroyer operating at 15 knots cruising speed consumed approximately 100 tons of fuel oil daily. The same destroyer, conducting high-speed operations at 25 to 30 knots, consumed 300 to 400 tons per day. Combat operations were never conducted at cruising speed, meaning fuel consumption rates were 3 to 4 times higher than peacetime planning assumptions. A destroyer on combat deployment might spend 2 weeks traveling to an operational area, 1 week conducting combat operations, then 2 weeks returning. During the combat week, it would consume as much fuel as it normally consumed in 3 to 4 weeks of peacetime cruising. Planning assumptions based on average cruising speeds were completely divorced from reality. By mid-1942, Japan operated dozens of destroyers simultaneously on various missions, each burning 3 to 4 times the planned fuel consumption, along with cruisers consuming even more, carriers and their air groups, battleships burning hundreds of tons daily even at moderate speeds, submarines and fleet oilers consuming fuel while delivering fuel. Total consumption quickly exceeded planning estimates by enormous margins. The actual numbers confirmed this. Japanese military consumption in fiscal year 1942, or April 1942 through March 1943, totaled 41.79 million barrels. Planning estimates had assumed 35 to 40 million barrels. Actual consumption was at the high end of estimates during a year when major operations were still ramping up. Fiscal year 1943 consumption reached 43.99 million barrels during the height of operations in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Capturing the Dutch East Indies did not solve the supply problem. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found oil infrastructure extensively sabotaged. Allied defenders, knowing they could not hold the territory, had systematically destroyed production capacity before retreating or surrendering. At Balikpapan in Borneo, one of the richest oil-producing regions in Southeast Asia, Dutch engineers demolished key facilities before Japanese arrival. They destroyed pumping stations with dynamite, demolished storage tanks, set wells on fire creating massive blazes that burned for weeks, dumped concrete down drill holes, rendering wells inoperable, removed critical refinery components and disposed of them, and sabotaged electrical systems and pipelines. The sabotage was not complete. Japanese forces moved quickly enough to capture some facilities relatively intact, but overall damage was substantial. Even facilities appearing intact often had subtle damage, missing parts, damaged seals, compromised safety systems, and equipment that looked functional but would fail under operation. Restoring production required skilled technicians Japan lacked in sufficient numbers. The Netherlands and Britain had developed sophisticated petroleum engineering expertise over decades operating these fields. Japan's domestic oil production from fields in Akita and Niigata totaled only about 3 million barrels annually. The entire Japanese petroleum engineering sector was perhaps 1/10 the size of what the Dutch and British had deployed in the East Indies. Most Dutch and British petroleum engineers had evacuated before Japanese forces arrived. Those captured were imprisoned rather than put to work due to security concerns, language barriers, and distrust of their loyalties. Japan had to send petroleum engineers from the home islands, but finding qualified personnel was difficult. Universities had not trained petroleum engineers in large numbers because Japan had virtually no domestic oil industry. Equipment posed even greater challenges. Oil field equipment is specialized, heavy, difficult to transport, and impossible to improvise. Drilling rigs weigh hundreds of tons and require specialized transportation. Refinery components are precisely manufactured and cannot be easily replaced. Japan needed to ship replacement equipment from the home islands, but merchant shipping was already stretched thin. The same ships that needed to carry oil from the captured fields to Japan also needed to carry equipment to those fields. Ships traveling south carried drilling equipment, refinery components, and pumping machinery. Ships traveling north carried crude oil and refined products. There were never enough ships to do both adequately. Moreover, American submarines increasingly targeted merchant ships. Every ship sunk carrying equipment south meant production in the oil fields could not be restored. Every ship sunk carrying oil north meant less fuel reached Japan. The submarines created a devastating trap. Japan needed equipment to restore production and ships to transport oil, but the same submarine campaign that sunk oil tankers also sunk the equipment vessels needed to restore production capacity. Production shortfalls. Production in captured territories struggled to reach pre-war levels. In 1940, before Japanese invasion, the Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels. In 1942, after Japanese occupation, production reached only 25.9 million barrels, less than 40% of pre-war production, despite major restoration efforts. The shortfall of nearly 40 million barrels represented oil that did not exist, could not be captured, and could not help Japan win the war. Japanese planners had assumed they would quickly restore full production, basing the entire war strategy on 65 million barrels per year being available. Actual production was less than half that level. In 1943, production improved to 49.6 million barrels as restoration efforts continued and more facilities came back online, 76% of pre-war levels, a significant achievement. However, by then, the tanker shortage had become critical. The oil fields were producing, but the oil could not reach Japan. The tanker crisis. Japanese strategists had not adequately calculated shipping capacity required to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan, nor how vulnerable that shipping would be to American submarine warfare. The geography was unforgiving. The distance from Borneo to Japan is approximately 2,000 nautical miles, even further from Sumatra. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 had cargo capacity of about 10,000 tons deadweight, translating to roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, the round trip from Borneo to Japan took approximately 4 weeks, including loading and unloading time. A single tanker could theoretically make about 13 trips per year, delivering approximately 975,000 barrels annually if operating continuously without losses or major delays. To transport 49 million barrels, the amount produced in captured territories in 1943, Japan needed approximately 50 tankers in continuous operation dedicated solely to oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies. This did not include tankers needed for moving oil between Japanese ports, supporting naval operations at sea, carrying aviation fuel, or tankers inevitably damaged, under repair, or sunk. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 49 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range oil transport, totaling about 500,000 gross tons. This included both Navy tankers and civilian tankers requisitioned for military use, barely sufficient for peacetime needs, catastrophically inadequate for war with all oil coming from distant conquered territories. Building new tankers required shipyard capacity and construction time. A tanker took approximately 8 to 10 months to build from keel laying to delivery. However, Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity building warships. Every month, shipyards launched destroyers, submarines, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. The Naval General Staff and government prioritized combat vessels over support vessels. Tankers were unglamorous. They didn't sink enemy ships or win battles. They just carried oil. Between December 1941 and December 1943, Japanese shipyards focused on warship construction. Some tankers were built, but not nearly enough to replace losses. The submarine campaign. American submarines systematically destroyed Japan's tanker fleet in one of the most successful submarine campaigns in naval history, operating under a doctrine specifically targeting Japanese logistics. Tankers were priority targets. Every tanker sunk represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japan. Submarines lurked along tanker routes between the Dutch East Indies and Japan, waiting near choke points. Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Taiwan became known as a killing ground. Tankers had to pass through to reach Japan from the south, and submarines waited in ambush. The impact was devastating. Each tanker sunk meant less oil transported, but the effects cascaded beyond simple tonnage losses. Each tanker lost meant remaining tankers had to make more trips to transport the same amount of oil. More trips meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more exposure to submarine attack, a death spiral where each loss made remaining tankers more vulnerable. Tanker crews became increasingly demoralized as losses mounted. Sailing on a tanker became one of the most dangerous jobs in the Japanese merchant marine. Tankers were slow, poorly armed, and often sailed with inadequate escorts because destroyers were needed elsewhere. Crews knew they were priority targets, and the psychological toll affected operations, even when tankers survived their voyages. Tanker captains began taking circuitous routes to avoid known submarine operating areas. Routes that should have taken 4 weeks began taking 5 or 6 weeks as captains zigzagged, hugged coastlines, and waited in protected anchorages for escorts. Longer voyages meant fewer trips per year. Fewer trips meant less oil transported even by surviving tankers. The submarine threat reduced effective tanker capacity even beyond actual sinkings. By late 1942, the tanker shortage had become critical. Japanese oil imports began declining not because production in conquered territories was falling, but because shipping to transport that oil was disappearing. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra with no ships available to move it. The submarine campaign had created a transportation choke point that strangled Japanese oil supplies. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels in September 1941 to approximately 38 million barrels. The decline of 12 million barrels in 7 months represented a burn rate far exceeding peacetime projections. The Navy alone consumed approximately 2.4 million barrels per month, significantly above planning estimates of 1.5 to 2 million barrels monthly. Admiral Yamamoto received detailed reports about the fuel situation in May 1942 as he prepared for the operation against Midway. The numbers were alarming. At current consumption rates, even with optimistic assumptions about oil production in captured territories and successful tanker voyages, Japan would exhaust its oil reserves sometime in 1943, possibly as early as mid-1943 if consumption remained at current levels or increased. Emergency measures and desperate proposals. The Naval General Staff held emergency meetings in Tokyo throughout summer and fall 1942 to discuss the fuel crisis. Every solution discussed had fundamental problems making implementation difficult or impossible. Dramatically increase tanker construction. Build 50 new tankers immediately to double or triple transport capacity. However, Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity around the clock. Building 50 tankers meant not building 50 destroyers, 10 cruisers, or 2 aircraft carriers. Combat vessels were needed to fight the war. Choosing tankers over warships meant accepting reduced combat capability. Moreover, tankers took 8 to 10 months to build. Ships begun in late 1942 would not enter service until mid to late 1943 at the earliest, possibly too late if reserves were exhausted before new tankers became available. Reduce operational tempo. Order all units to minimize fuel consumption, reduce training flights, limit naval exercises, keep ships in port unless operationally necessary. However, reducing operations meant ceding initiative to the Americans, allowing enemy forces to advance without opposition and watching American power grow while Japanese forces sat idle. Every week of reduced operations was a week Americans used to build more ships, train more pilots, and move closer to Japan. Trading fuel conservation for operational weakness was trading one form of defeat for another. Move major fleet units closer to the oil source. Base battleships and large carriers at Singapore or in waters around Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. This was actually implemented. Ships stationed near oil fields could refuel directly without requiring tanker transport to Japan, saving tanker capacity for other purposes and keeping the fleet fueled. However, stationing the fleet thousands of miles from Japan created its own problems. Decisive battles were happening in the Central Pacific, at Midway in June 1942, at Guadalcanal starting in August 1942, at Tarawa in November 1943, at the Marianas in June 1944. These battles were fought 2,000 to 3,000 miles from Singapore. Ships supposed to defend Japan sat near Borneo because that was where the fuel was. By the time orders could be sent, fleets could sortie, and ships could steam thousands of miles to battle areas. Engagements were often decided. The American advance continued while Japanese battleships sat idle near oil fields. Use lower-grade fuels. Tankers could carry unrefined Borneo crude directly to naval bases rather than refined bunker fuel. Ships could burn crude directly. This was actually attempted. Japanese warships in 1943 and 1944 increasingly burned unrefined crude oil. The consequences were predictable. Crude oil contains sulfur, salt, sediments, and other contaminants that refined bunker fuel has removed. Burning crude caused rapid accumulation of deposits in boilers and fireboxes. Boiler tubes became clogged and less efficient. Heat transfer degraded. Ships burning crude developed maintenance problems at accelerated rates. Boiler cleaning, normally done every few months, had to be done every few weeks. Some ships suffered boiler failures, leaving them dead in the water, requiring tows to repair facilities. Using crude oil saved transportation capacity, but degraded fleet readiness and created long-term maintenance problems. Develop synthetic fuel production. Germany had successfully developed synthetic fuel from coal. Japan could do the same. However, synthetic fuel production required massive industrial investment, specialized equipment, and coal of specific quality. Building synthetic fuel plants took years. The technology was complex, and Japan lacked the expertise Germany had developed over 2 decades of research. Small-scale experiments were attempted, but never reached industrial production levels that could meaningfully offset the oil shortage. Synthetic fuel remained a theoretical solution that could not be implemented quickly enough to matter. The arithmetic of defeat. By September 1942, Japanese consumption averaged approximately 3.7 million barrels per month, while imports from captured territories fell short of that level. The deficit came from reserves. Every month, Japan's strategic stockpile shrank. The Navy estimated that at current trends, reserves would drop below 10 million barrels by mid-1943. Below 10 million, the Navy considered reserves inadequate for sustained operations. This was the crisis threshold. The fundamental problem was arithmetic that admitted no solution. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels per year minimum to sustain military operations at the intensity required to fight the United States. After accounting for submarine losses and transportation inefficiencies, Japan could import at most 20 to 25 million barrels per year from captured territories. Domestic production added only 3 million barrels annually. Synthetic fuel contributed negligible amounts. There was a structural deficit of 12 to 17 million barrels per year. No combination of efficiency measures, operational restrictions, or technical adaptations could close a gap that large. The mathematics were inexorable. By mid-1943, Japanese oil reserves had dropped to approximately 15 million barrels, less than one-third of pre-war levels. American submarines had devastated the tanker fleet. Ships that survived faced dangerous waters and took circuitous routes, burning much of their cargo as fuel for their own engines. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operated at the extreme limit of their fuel range. They could not maneuver freely because every unnecessary mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, on the contrary, had virtually unlimited fuel, supported by a massive logistics train of fleet oilers providing complete operational freedom. The difference was not about courage or skill, it was about mathematics. America had the oil and tankers to deliver it. Japan had neither. The final collapse. By late 1944, Japanese oil imports had collapsed almost completely. Most tankers had been sunk. The few that survived could barely operate. Many ships sat at anchor with empty fuel bunkers, unable to sortie even when ordered. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese forces made a desperate sortie that consumed most of their remaining fuel reserves. The operation was not designed as a one-way mission, but severe fuel shortages meant ships could barely return to port afterwards. The fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel exhaustion. At April 1945, the battleship Yamato made her final sortie to Okinawa. Operation Tengo was explicitly designed as a suicide mission. Orders called for minimal fuel, just enough to reach Okinawa, where the ship would beach itself and fight as a stationary gun platform. Local base commanders at Tokuyama secretly provided more fuel than the bare minimum order specified, approximately 60% of full capacity rather than just enough for a one-way trip. This act of defiance showed how controversial the suicide mission was, even within the Japanese Navy. However, even 60% fuel was probably insufficient for a return voyage. Yamato was sunk by American aircraft on April 7, 1945. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, oil reserves were effectively exhausted. The combined fleet was immobilized. Most major warships had been sunk, but those that survived sat in port with empty bunkers. Oil fields in the Dutch East Indies were still producing, but the oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo. Japan had fought the entire war under a fuel deficit it could never overcome, a deficit that existed before the war started, a deficit that was predictable and calculable from the mathematics of consumption versus supply. Understanding the truth. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this from the very beginning. On January 7, 1941, before planning for Pearl Harbor had even begun in earnest, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa. In that letter, Yamamoto stated clearly that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity was vastly greater. American oil production was hundreds of times larger than Japan's domestic production. If the war lasted more than 6 to 8 months, Japan would face inevitable defeat. Yamamoto wrote that the only possibility of success was a quick knockout blow that might shock Americans into negotiating a settlement. However, even that possibility was remote, because Americans historically did not surrender after initial defeats. They became more determined, not less. Yamamoto never believed Pearl Harbor would actually achieve a decisive strategic result. He knew the mathematics did not support a Japanese victory. Yamamoto was trapped by institutional pressures that shaped all Japanese planning. He could express doubts in private letters and make pessimistic predictions in conversations with trusted colleagues, but he could not publicly refuse to plan the operation. That would have been seen as insubordination, disloyalty, and undermining national unity. His career would have been destroyed, and someone else would have been appointed to design the attack. So Yamamoto planned Pearl Harbor to the best of his ability, knowing it would probably fail strategically, hoping desperately that somehow Americans would react differently than history suggested. On the morning of December 7th, when Commander Genda stood on Akagi's deck watching the second wave return, he understood all of this. He knew the fuel tanks had not been attacked. He knew they should have been attacked. He knew that leaving them intact was a tactical error that cost Japan months of operational advantage. However, Genda also knew something else. Even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, even if Pearl Harbor had been rendered completely useless, even if the American Pacific Fleet had been forced to withdraw to California, the mathematics still did not work. Japan still did not have enough oil to win. Fuel consumption rates were still too high. Tanker capacity was still too low. Captured oil fields could not produce enough to meet demand. Destroying Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks would have delayed American offensive operations by perhaps 6 to 12 months, but it would not have changed the outcome. The outcome was determined by mathematics that existed before the first bomb fell. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels of oil per year minimum to sustain military operations at the intensity required to fight the United States. Japan had access to approximately 25 to 30 million barrels per year from all sources combined, after accounting for transportation losses. The deficit was 10 to 15 million barrels per year. No amount of tactical brilliance, fighting spirit, or superior training could overcome a deficit of 10 to 15 million barrels per year. Industrial wars cannot be fought without industrial resources. Naval operations cannot be sustained without fuel. Arithmetic cannot be wished away because the numbers are politically inconvenient. The true fatal error. That was the fatal error that doomed Japan, not the tactical decision to focus on battleships instead of fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor, not the operational decision to withdraw after 2 waves instead of launching a third strike. The fatal error was going to war in the first place, based on assumptions about fuel consumption, oil production, and tanker capacity that were demonstrably wrong. Assumptions made by planners who prioritized what leadership wanted to hear over what the mathematics actually said. Multiple officers in the Japanese Navy understood the resource constraints. They understood Japan lacked the oil to sustain a prolonged war. However, institutional culture discouraged dissent. Officers who raised objections to approved plans were seen as lacking loyalty and fighting spirit. The path to career advancement was supporting leadership decisions, not questioning them. Speaking uncomfortable truths was career suicide. Consequently, the people who understood the mathematics stayed quiet. The people who did not understand the mathematics made the decisions. Japan went to war with fuel consumption projections that underestimated actual requirements. Oil production estimates that overestimated what captured fields could deliver, and tanker capacity calculations that ignored inevitable losses to submarine warfare. Post-war reflections. Captain Kamato Kuroshima, the brilliant staff officer, survived the war. The failure of Japanese strategic planning speaks for itself. The assumptions built into the war plan were wrong. The calculations were wrong, and the consequences were catastrophic. Commander Minoru Genda also survived the war, remaining in military service and eventually becoming Chief of Staff of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force, serving from 1959 to 1962. He also entered politics. In interviews throughout his life, he consistently stated that even if the Pearl Harbor attack had been executed perfectly, even if every target had been destroyed, Japan would still have lost the war. The industrial and resource imbalance was simply too great to overcome. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see Japan's defeat. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville. Japanese cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes and learned his flight schedule. The mission to intercept him was personally approved by President Roosevelt. Yamamoto died knowing the fuel crisis was developing exactly as he had predicted. He died knowing that no amount of tactical victories could overcome the mathematical realities of oil consumption versus supply. The fundamental lesson. The fundamental lesson is both simple and profound. Wars are not won by courage alone, nor by superior tactics or better training. They're won by logistics, industrial capacity, and resources. By the unglamorous mathematics of how much fuel you have versus how much fuel you need. Japan needed 40 million barrels per year. Japan had 25 million barrels per year. The war was lost in that arithmetic. Everything else, all the battles, all the sacrifice, all the superior tactics building. When nations ignore mathematics because it contradicts political goals, when institutions suppress analysis because it challenges approved strategies, when leaders choose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable facts, the result is not just defeat, it is catastrophe. This story is not really about petroleum or logistics. It is about institutional culture, about political pressures that override rational analysis, about officers who knew uncomfortable truths but stayed silent, about leaders who chose to believe what they wanted to believe rather than what the numbers actually said.